Hello and welcome back to 123 Java. Today we're going to be talking about loops, why we use loops, different kinds of loops, what they're useful for, and particularly the distinction between for loops and while loops, which are the most simple versions of these kinds of loops. So just to start out by explaining why we would use a loop for anything. Essentially, the purpose of a loop is to execute some piece of code multiple times. So just as a very basic example, here I have a program that prints every number between 1 and 5 included. So if I go ahead and run this, that'll print all these numbers. So that works just fine, and this is fine as it is. But there are a lot of different situations in which you might encounter you'll have to repeat a piece of code multiple times, and this number could be way, way larger than, let's say, 5 lines. There are also cases where you don't actually know how many times you want to execute that code, and that's where loops get to be really, really crucial. So just as a basic example, I'm going to show you how I would make this same thing happen using a loop, which is going to require less code. It's going to be shorter to write, and it's just better style. Because loops exist, you would practically never do something like this. So let me go ahead and comment this out. So there are two types of loops you can use. You can use a for loop, and you can use a while loop. Well, for now, we'll talk about those. They pretty much, in most cases, will do the same thing, but it's all about the syntax and the formatting that's a little different. So let me start out by doing this business right here with a for loop. So every for loop, every basic for loop at least, will look something like this. And inside these parentheses, you're always going to give it 3 pieces of information. So you're going to start out almost always with an integer. Let's call this integer I. Now, in the previous video, we talked about when you declare a variable, you always need to, well, not always, but it's very, very convenient for you to initialize this variable right away. So I would say in many of the cases you're going to see this first part of the for loop is going to be some kind of integer called I. Not necessarily I, you can name it anything you want actually. And it's, in most cases, I would say, going to start at 0 or 1. Because you can loop through so many different things. And in many of the cases that you're going to be using loops for, you're going to want to start at 0 because you might be like looping through a string or an array, and those both use 0 indexing, where the very first index starts at 0, and you want to always start your loop, well, not always, but in most cases, start your loop from the first index you're dealing with to be able to do that, because you don't want to miss an index. But for the sake of this program right here, we can, since we were just printing from 1 to 5, we can just start at 1, because essentially this first part of the for loop is where you're starting the loop command. Like, where are you starting it? Okay, so that's the first part. So you want to start at 1 because you want to print 1 first. And the next thing you need to do is you need to tell the for loop when the iteration is going to stop. So we have this variable I, and inside of this loop is where we're going to write the code that's going to be executed multiple times. So essentially this, we would only have to write it one time, and you'll see that in a second. But you need to tell it when to stop, because if we don't tell it when to stop, it could print this forever, and we only want to give it a given number of times. So in this case, you want to print 1, you want to print 2, you want to print 3, you want to print 4, and you want to print 5. So we're going to stop when I is greater than or equal to 5. Okay, so we have that. Then this last parameter that you're giving the loop is by how many are you incrementing I. So again, in the vast majority of cases, it's going to be by 1 each time. So you could do I equals I plus 1, or another way, just different syntax is typically better syntax. It would just be to write I plus plus, and this just increments I by 1 each time. So let's go over that again. So here's your loop. You're going to write the code that's going to be executed multiple times inside of the loop. But when you're writing a for loop, you need to give it 3 things. First, you need to tell it where to start. That's here. Then you're going to tell it how long it needs to go before it needs to stop. So this command, this code, is going to keep going every time until I is no longer smaller than 5. Okay? And this is the third part. You're going to tell it by how many times you want this value I to be incremented by. So here it's just I plus plus because each time I gets incremented by 1. But say I wanted to print every 5th number. I would do like something like I equals I plus 5. This obviously would change because we want it to go for longer, but then it wouldn't print out just 1, 2, 3, 4. It would print like 0, 5, etc. But this is the most simple and I would say the most common way you'll see a for loop written with this I plus plus here, because typically you want to iterate through every single index or every single something. Okay, so we have this format. Now inside of these brackets is where you tell it exactly what is going to be executed multiple times. So you're going to see, like, obviously in this, what we've written here, there's obviously a pattern, right? And the whole purpose of a loop is to avoid writing things over and over again. So you'll see what we've written over and over again is this system.out.println. But we don't want to have to write that again. And the good news is you don't. So you only have to write it once. And what the looping will do is it will execute this system.out.println every time the loop runs through. But then obviously we need to tell it what to print, like we did up here. And that's where the crucial part of the loop comes in. And that's why this is so useful. So the good news, because we've written a loop, is we don't have to constantly write what the next value will be to be printed. You know, we don't have to write 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4. That's what all of this up here is doing. So really, if you just go in and type I, if you look back into how you formatted this, you're going to see why that makes sense, why it's going to print 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Because you're starting at I equals 1. Is I smaller than 5? Yes, it is, because it's equal to 1 now. And then this is going to happen after this code executes. So it's going to print I is 1, so it's going to print 1. Then it loops back again. Now, I is no longer 1 because this is its starting point. So now this is going to happen. I is going to get incremented by 1. So now I is equal to 2. Is 2 smaller than 5? Yes. So this will execute again. And this time it'll print the new value of I, which is now 2. And it's going to go back again and do the same thing. Now, this has happened once more. So I is equal to 3 now. Is 3 smaller than 5? Yes. So this code is going to happen again. And you'll see how that's going to work when I run this. Oh, well, I mistakenly gave it one less. It actually should be, less than or equal to 5, because we do want it to run when it's 5, because we do want this 5 to be included. So that should work if we run this now. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this has done exactly what we did up here, just by creating this loop. So as you can see, it just looks nicer, only 2 lines of code versus this was 5 lines of code. If you want to do this 20 times, 30 times, no more lines of code will be needed. You're just going to have to change these parameters, and that's it. That's why loops are so great. So we've done this in a for loop. Now, another kind of loop you're going to see is a while loop. And in many circumstances, while and for loops do the exact same thing, and they can be used for the exact same thing. The only thing that's really different about them is just the formatting. So I'll show you how we can make this exact same thing happen just with the syntax being with a while loop. So the way a while loop works is this part goes before the loop. So let's make this integer j just to keep that distinction. Equals 1. Now we start the loop. Now in the while loop, you don't need these 3 parameters here because you've given this first one here and this last one's going to go down here, you're going to see. The only one that needs to go inside of this these parentheses for this while loop is this second one, okay? So inside of these parentheses is the condition for when the loop will be run. So each time the loop starts back up again, it's going to check to make sure that this is still true. Because if I is 6, it'll see that this condition is false and then the loop won't execute. And that's why you won't get 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 printed in this problem here. So now here's the body of the loop. Oh, whoops, this is j, sorry. So now, just like we did in our for loop, this is where the actual command happens. So we can just go ahead and copy and paste that. Our variable is j now though. Okay. But we still need to update this variable. We want it to be incremented. Because if we don't, this will just go on forever. So we can write essentially exactly what we've put up here, just down here. And this is just a syntax thing. Like, we're doing the exact same thing that we did up here. We're just changing the location of some of these things because it's just different formatting for a while loop. So let's run this. So here's our for loop, and here's our while loop. It's done the exact same thing, just different formatting. Now, there are some distinctions between while and for loops, because you might be asking, why do we have 2 different kinds of loops when they do the exact same thing? Well, so the reason why you might use a while loop over a for loop is because while loops can be used when you don't know the exact number of when the exact amount of times this code will be executed. Like, sometimes you just don't know that this value or that number in your head before you write the code. And so a while loop won't require you to give it an exact number. So for instance, you could have a Boolean that's true. And this while loop, this is just one example, is going to keep executing as long as this is true. Now that might seem confusing at first, but it's going to make sense later on when, for instance, you might have a really complex thing going on inside of this loop, and something might eventually happen to this Boolean b that will make this b eventually become false. And once that b is false, when it tries to go back up into this loop, b is false now, and it won't make this stuff happen. So that might be a little confusing at first, but just know that the main reason you would use a while loop over a for loop is because for a for loop, you always need to know the exact number of iterations for when you want to stop, for when you want to execute the code. You always need to know the exact number or the exact length, whatever it might be. Whereas a while loop, you can be like a little more, I would say, general with it. You don't have to provide it an exact value, but you still do have to provide some kind of condition. It's just that that condition might be affected later on in here. So you don't need to give it an exact value right away. Sorry if that might be a little confusing, but yeah, just know that you can, for the most part, do the same things in both of these kinds of loops. And this is a very simple way to explain it, a very simple problem, but that's just your basic introduction to for and while loops. So thank you for watching. Hope that made sense.